Welcome to this Insight 2022 session on how do you know if you've made an ethical decision, which is a question you'll be able to answer by 3 o'clock. It's a session run by myself, Fraser Batty, from the Strategy Unit, but primarily my role here is going to be to tee up the session, to say something about logistics, and then to ask questions of our guest, Angie Hobbs, who I'll say something more about in a moment. Rachel, if you just go on to the next slide. This is one session in a fortnight of sessions, all themed around the science and the craft of decision making. To help the session along, if you could just note several things, please. The first thing to note is that all of these sessions are recorded and they're shared. We put them on our YouTube channel. So please treat this as though you were in the public square. If you could keep your microphones muted, that would be very much appreciated, and that means we can focus in on Angie and what she has to say. And if you could use the chat box for questions, we'll see how things go. We're hoping we get some time for questions at the end of the session. And so if you can put questions in the chat box, I'll be able to put some of them to Angie at the end. And please also use the chat box for any technical issues. The final thing I'd like to do is to tweet. I mean, assuming Twitter is still with us, as of late November, we still have a Twitter. If you do, we've got a hashtag Insight 2022, and I've put the Midlands Decision Support Network account, the Strategy Unit account, and also Angie's account. She's prolific on Twitter. So please tweet about the session. Rachel, if you could stop sharing now, I just want to say a few very quick words, really, to introduce Angie, our guest today. Angie is the Professor of the Public Understanding of Philosophy at Sheffield, which is a post that was created for her, and as far as we can tell, a world first, I think. Mm-hmm. Her educational background is at Cambridge. She was educated in the classics and also in ancient philosophy. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. And I think the thing that struck me about Angie's work most is that she is very adept, I would say, at taking the ideas, the concepts, the tools, the methods from philosophy and applying it to challenges in the real world, challenges of public policy, challenges of the provision of services and those kinds of things. So I know that she's done work, for example, with the World Economic Forum. I know that she's done work with the different Houses of Parliament in the UK and with the Scottish Parliament, and has also done some work to bring philosophy to schools as well. As part of that work, Angie's had several appearances in the media, including Test Match Special. She's got her own edition of Desert Island Discs, which is the one, if you don't know, where you get marooned and then you're thrown various lifelines, I think, by the interviewer. And 25 appearances in our time. Is that right? 25 appearances, including popping up on my audiobook the other day as I was driving to Wales. So you don't know that, but you were accompanying me on a long road trip to Wales. We came across Angie and her work because at the Strategy Unit and the Decision Support Network, we were doing a lot of work on inequity, and in particular, inequity of access to planned hospital care. And the work that we did started in May 2021 with a piece of analysis that Stephen Wyatt led, which showed that there really was some gross inequities in access to elective care, and it skewed in favour of the wealthy. So overwhelmingly, if you were from a wealthier background, you were much more likely to receive elective care. And the analysis also showed that hadn't always been the case. That really became the case after around the 2010 period. Before that, access to elective care actually skewed in favour of people from more deprived backgrounds. So we'd watched over time this problem of inequity get worse, all the while against a backdrop of policy concerns around inequalities rising. So we got a policy narrative increasing, saying we needed to do more, all the while the problem was getting worse. We could also see that post-pandemic, as waiting lists increased, there would be more pressure than ever to rip through waiting lists, to get the waiting list right down, and to do so in as efficient a manner as possible. And that doing that might actually tend to make existing patterns of inequity worse. So we'd spotted this problem, we were very concerned about it. And then in May of this year, we put out a report which suggested what could be done. So we suggested a range of different strategies that you could do to reduce inequities in access to elective care. And when we did that, we knew we were raising various different issues. We were raising legal issues, we were raising practical issues, we were raising issues for the public. But we also knew we were raising ethical issues. And so we asked Angie if she would look at our reports, if she would conduct an ethical review of the strategies that we suggested to reduce inequities in planned care, and to see what she found. So we'll talk a bit about that, but we'll also talk much more generally as well about the role of ethics in decision making, and about ways in which the people who make decisions could take comfort in processes they could use to make more ethical decisions. So what we're going to do is I'm going to put questions Angie's way, and then hopefully at the end we'll have time for some questions from people participating in the session. I wanted to begin, Angie. I mean, I know you do all of this work engaging with different bits of public services and different bits of public policy, but like, how did you find doing the review for this bit of the NHS? How because you don't know the NHS, do you? So how did you find the process?
Yeah, what a good question. Yes, that you're absolutely right. I mean, all I'd done with doctors and nurses before is I had written an article on differences between ancient and modern conceptions of mental health and physical health and illness. And I'd given talks about that, but that was really the only thing. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I've worked with the military, with the church, with politicians, with governments, with businesses and banks, but this was really a first. So I did, sad academic that I am, I did so much research. I was completely intrigued. And so I read the NHS Constitution, of course, as well as your report. I read that Ipsos poll, which was conducted on what people, I think, in Coventry and Warwickshire thought about using non-clinical factors in prioritising waiting lists. I read the Hill Dickinson legal review that you'd commissioned of your report. I read your blogs, your wonderful blogs on how to make better decisions. So I did a lot, and I ended up with over 300 pages of notes. Which I then eventually reduced to a 26-page ethics review for you. And yeah, completely fascinating. And I mean, the very brief sort of, we'll talk in detail, but the very brief heads up was I didn't find a single one of your strategies was ethically unviable. They were all, each strategy that you suggest is ethically viable. That's the great news. Now, there are some complications, there are some caveats, not really arising out of your report, but arising out of the background in the NHS Constitution and how it relates to targets and QALYs and so on. But so we'll look at that. But yeah, utterly fascinating.
That's brilliant. And I see we've put some links to the materials in the chat box for people that haven't seen them. I'd like to start with a really foundational question as well, if that's okay. I mean, one way of thinking about ethics is that it's for professional ethicists. It's for people who think about ethics, isn't it? And I know that's not what you think. So could you just make the case, why does ethics matter? And why should those of us who make choices in health and social care, why should we consider ethics when we do that?
Well, I hope that, you know, in everything we do in our lives, we remember we're not just bearers of a role in a job, but we are human beings, and that we will have a better life, that those around us in our society will have a better life if we do care about these things. But there are more precise reasons. I mean, so the NHS Constitution itself is absolutely imbued with all sorts of values. And as we'll see, mainly to do with fairness and rights-based ethics, but also stuff from other ethical traditions. So it's right there in your constitution. There are also legal requirements in the Equality Act 2010, in the Health and Care Act 2022. So there are legal requirements to take account of human rights and you know, not discriminating against protected characteristics. So that there's all that. And if you don't do it, as well, I hope, as feeling, you know, I want people to feel good when they go to bed at the end of the day and think, I made a bit of a difference today. That was a good day at work. I helped people. I helped my community. That feels good to feel that, our lives have value and purpose. But more pragmatically, if you don't look after ethics, you are going to get hit legally, financially, just in terms of hassle, bureaucracy, stress, it's absolutely worth your while to have these conversations about how to make an ethically justifiable decision before it comes back to bite you. And I want to stress right at the beginning that I saw my brief as simply how to make an ethically justifiable decision, not necessarily the right clinical decision. I'm not a doctor. So I wasn't getting involved in what the best clinical decision is. I'm not even necessarily saying this is going to be ethically the only and best decision you can make. I'm saying here is a process which, if you follow it with the qualities of, you know, integrity and humility and thoughtfulness that we'll come back to, you will be making an ethically justifiable decision, and one that you can live within your conscience, but also you can, you know, if you're ever questioned about it at work or by a legal team, you can say, look, we went through this process. So yeah, and so even if at a later stage new facts emerge, new data emerge, a virus takes, you know, mutates in a way that you couldn't reasonably have predicted, even if in the future you look back and say, you know what, I actually wish we'd made a different ethical decision at that time. But that's not, you can't know that now. You can't know that now. So we're saying an ethically justifiable decision right now with the inevitably limited facts that, you know, and knowledge of the future that you've got available to you.
I remember you saying that early in our conversations, and was very struck by that, because it seemed to me that that would equip people who are making necessarily ethically very difficult decisions in some cases with some degree of comfort that they could make a justifiable decision. So I was very attracted to that early on. So you said, I mean, you say we all need to care about ethics. We all need to have this at the heart of our decision making. So we can't outsource it all to people like you. If that's true, then not many of us are trained in ethics. Not many of us are schooled in the different approaches of ethics in Western thought or even beyond. Could you just sketch out? I know there are different, because of having done the work with you, I know there are different approaches to thinking about ethics in Western philosophy. Could you just give us a little sketch of the different approaches?
Yes, I'll give you a little thumbnail sketch of the three main approaches that we use in Western philosophy, and then I'll say a tiny little bit more about each, but not much. So first up, you've got what we would call a rights-based ethics, an ethics based on notions of rights and duties, in which fairness is really important. The whole idea there is that each person counts as an individual, not just as a number. Each person matters individually as a separate bearer of rights. And that fairness approach is hugely important. Then there's what we might call a consequentialist approach, where you're looking at the outcomes of actions, as the title suggests, the consequences of actions. The most famous version of consequentialism is utilitarianism, looking at the greatest good of the greatest number. And again, lots of problems with how to interpret that. We'll come back to that in a second. And then thirdly is what we might call an ethics of flourishing or well-being and virtue. Or if you don't like the word virtue, of qualities of character. And that's slightly different from the other two, that an ethics, rights-based ethics and consequentialist ethics are looking at actions, whereas ethics of well-being and virtue or qualities of character is looking at what we call the agent in ethics, the person. And that's about a whole person living a whole life. And as we'll discuss in a moment, it's something I've worked on a lot myself. So those are the three main kind of approaches, if you like, to ethics: rights-based, consequentialist, and an ethics of virtue and flourishing, or if you don't like the word flourishing, well-being. There are other approaches in the West, but I would say, and many philosophers would say, you could kind of bring those other approaches under one of those main heads. So I'm sure many of the people on this call will have heard about an care ethics, ethics of care, very naturally for the NHS, but many people, including myself, would say, well, actually, that can be a subset of an ethics of flourishing and virtue. Or Contractualist ethics is often, such as John Rawls, that would be very much a version of rights-based ethics. So those are the three main approaches. Now, they're in themselves, none of them requires a religious framework, but all of them can be made compatible with most religious frameworks. Not all, I'm not claiming they can be compatible with Druidism or whatever, but I mean, so in themselves, they don't necessarily require a religious framework. And I did, in my report, I did very much concentrate on Western approaches because those are what I know about. So I didn't look at the various religion and tradition-based approaches, such as, I don't know, Ubuntu or Shintoism or Buddhism or so on. So those are the three main approaches. Now, then none of them is completely uncomplicated, even within themselves. So an ethics of fairness, rights-based ethics, are you talking about a community or an individual? Really relevant for your report. Are we looking at a group of disadvantaged people or at individual lives? In consequentialist ethics, lots of issues. Does the greatest good mean? What number are we talking about? How big is the community? Are we talking about future generations? Something really relevant, as we'll see in a minute, for your the NHS constitution, are tensions between quality and quantity. So there are issues within consequentialism, and again within an ethics of flourishing and virtue. Again, are we talking about the individual or about a community? How do they interrelate? So within those three approaches, there are questions to ask, and also there can be tensions within those approaches. There can particularly be tensions between a rights-based approach based on sort of human rights and fairness, and consequences. If you're trying to get lots of throughput and treat the most number of people in the shortest amount of time for the least amount of money, that can clash with various rights of certain citizens. So there can be tensions both within and between those three approaches. But the crucial thing for people making these ethical decisions to remember, which should give everybody confidence, is they're all ethical approaches. They're all ethical. So if you're really thinking, you may be deciding which one to choose or whatever, but whatever you're going to do, if you're thinking thoughtfully about one of these approaches, you're going to be making an ethical decision of sorts. It might not be the best ethical decision, but you're not going to be unethical. So that should give people some confidence.
That's brilliant. I mean, for those of us who've done, let's say, bits of health economics, for example, and we've approached the question of ethics, it's always been entirely within a consequentialist framework. I didn't really know until you exposed these different ways of thinking. Yeah. I personally wasn't aware of them at all. So it's really nice to hear you to talk those ones through. So three different approaches that you've outlined.
Yeah.
Can I draw you off the fence a little? I mean, are there one of those schools that you're particularly attracted to?
Well, in my academic work, I'm particularly attracted to what I would call an ethics of flourishing and virtue. And as I said, if people are not happy with that terminology, an ethics of well-being and qualities of character. Why? Because, as I've said, it focuses on what in philosophy we'd call the agent. I mean, that's just a fancy word for the person living the life and doing the actions. Because it's treating a whole person, living a whole life in context, in their environment. And furthermore, it's looking at how they fit into their community and the relation between an ethics of flourishing and virtue and a small p politics of flourishing and virtue. By politics, I don't mean any one political party. I simply mean the word going back to its ancient Greek root of a polis, living in a community-based ethics. So for me, it's a realistic ethics, because people might not, we all care about wanting well-being. We all care about flourishing. We may or may not think we care about virtues and qualities of character, though I hope to show by the end of our session that they really matter for living a good life and for making good decisions. But everybody's invested in their own well-being and their own flourishing. So you're starting from a point of agreement that we're invested in this, we care about this, why wouldn't we? So that's why I find it particularly attractive. And I think that sometimes, not always, sometimes an ethics of, I'll call it flourishing and virtue, you'll have to live with that, can help resolve some of the tensions that we've noticed already between a rights-based ethics, which focuses on fairness, and a consequences-based ethics, which is looking at the greatest good of the greatest number. And in the ethics review, we can maybe come back to this later, I actually mentioned 3 or 4 points in the care pathway where I thought an ethics of flourishing and virtue can actually help resolve some of those tensions.
That's excellent. You touched there on tensions, and you said earlier that the 3 different schools have tensions between them, within themselves, and between one another as well. I was really interested when you reviewed the Constitution.
Yeah.
And you said many of the things you then point to in terms of strategies for reducing inequities and access to elective care actually are a consequence of many of the tensions and difficulties in the Constitution itself. You know, there's no hatchet job here on the Constitution, but just in descriptive terms, what did you find when you reviewed the NHS Constitution with the ethicist hat on? What did you see?
Yes, so it's a really interesting and important document. It's a good framework, but it's mainly rights-based. It's mainly based on the rights of the patient, normally the patient, occasionally the rights of practitioners are looked at, but mainly the rights of the patient. So it's fairness. It's the language of fairness is there throughout. And in my review, I actually go through different paragraphs and sentences where it talks about fairness and rights. So that's the dominant ethic. However, just to make life fun and spicy and interesting, there are bits of the Constitution which are consequentialist in their language, where they talk about getting, best value from taxpayers' money and the most efficient outcome, very consequentialist language. And there are even 1 or 2 bits where it references an ethic of well-being. Indeed, the opening sentence, the absolute opening claim is they're there to increase the well-being of individuals and communities. So it's got a little bit of all 3. Now, the good news there is that, you're going to be able to find evidence to support pretty much any ethical strategy within the NHS Constitution. There will be a bit that will serve your purposes. And there are lots of sentences which very specifically, very literally serve your purpose of trying to reduce inequalities and access to planned hospital care. To slightly complicate matters, because of this mix, there's also bits in the Constitution where you think, oh, hang on, that bit doesn't quite fit, because that, there's a tension with consequences there and so on. And also because the Constitution it really sits on the fence about whether it's about the fairness towards individuals or towards communities, which is great. We want fairness to everybody, but sometimes you have to choose between different communities or between a community and other individuals. So yeah, you can always find support for what you want in the NHS Constitution, but that also leaves you with other bits of the Constitution which won't be supporting what you want. The other issue I found was that, because I was trying to look at your report in the whole context of where the ethical framework in the NHS. So I was also looking at targets and I was looking at qualis, which both of those are nearly always framed in consequentialist language. So you've also got this fundamental tension between your Constitution, which is mostly rights-based, mostly talking about fairness, and qualis and targets, which are mostly framed in the language of the greatest good of the greatest number and consequences.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Could you just expand on that tension a little bit more for us, please? So there's the the use of targets is, I suppose, is plainly consequentialist, isn't it? Because we're setting numerical targets around an outcome, around a consequence. And the qualities, the quality adjusted life years. Yes. Again, we're interested then in the consequences. We want more quality adjusted life years in the world. Could you just elaborate on the tension between having a rights-based approach and then introducing devices that are very consequentialist?
Well, with both targets and with qualis, very often there is an unintended consequence, I think, of I won't say discriminating against, I want something softer. They often do not work in favour of those in socioeconomically disadvantaged groups. Because in terms of targets. It can be quicker and cheaper to get more people from, I don't know, more advantaged groups through the system. They may be easier to reach. They may be cheaper to get to the hospital. They may, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of reasons why in targets, focusing on throughput in terms of numbers and time can work against a socioeconomically disadvantaged group. The same with QALYs. If you're just looking at, and again, when there's lots of problems with QALYs, not least, what does quality of life mean? Is, what are we talking just about health or overall happiness? But for your report, the issue is, if you're looking at quality of adjusted life years, there can often be a better prognosis for people from more advantaged backgrounds who may, not always, but may have fewer comorbidities. So if you've got, say, some poor chap who's been homeless for many years and who eventually does get access to hospital for treatment, but the poor guy may have had years of alcohol and drug abuse and pneumonia through being outside in the cold, etc. I mean, there may be an awful lot of comorbidities, and they just may take longer to treat and be more expensive to treat, and their they may have a prognosis of fewer quality of life years ahead of them. But so why I'm interested in my ethics of flourishing and well-being is we're looking at people's lives right now. We're not kind of predicting how many quality of life years they've got ahead of them. We're looking at how the treatment might impact on their life right now. And in that way, it seems to me there's a less chance of people from disadvantaged backgrounds and circumstances getting a rough deal of those quantitative assessments.
I feel slightly guilty. I think we gave you the word throughput, didn't we? I think there's horrible.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, that was horrible. Oh, sorry.
There's terrible bits of NHS management ease. We've
sorry, I'm guilty.
No,
I had to ask you what it meant.
I know, and now you're freely using it. I feel terrible. I like the way when we first started talking, and you were talking about an ethics of virtue and of well-being and of flourishing. It seemed to me to encompass a broader range of things that humans might care about, that we might want to pursue in our life, and not seek to boil things down to, say, the single metric of the QALY. So I think that's interesting. I'd like to ask you, though, to elaborate upon the review that you did for us. So we looked at the problem of inequities in access to elective care, and then we proposed a set of approaches to address it, things that integrated care boards could do if they wanted to address this problem. And we knew that doing that would surface a range of different ethical considerations, which is why we asked you to do the work. So when you reviewed our report recommending these different strategies, what ethical issues did it raise for you? And did this approach of thinking more in terms of flourishing or of well-being help you to resolve any of those tensions?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, so as I said, the headline news is there wasn't a single strategy that you suggested which is individually unviable. There's nothing that I read and I thought, oh no, that can't work. That's just how, that's an ethical non-starter. There wasn't one. So that's the good news. There were some issues that I discuss in the report. Again, it's this that always are we looking at the individual or the community here? So your strategies for now, if you're improving the lives of lots of people who are from a disadvantaged background, you may well be improving the life of that community, that disadvantaged community, but that there can be then tensions between fairness to that community and fairness to people in other communities. And we can come back to one or two examples of that. I kept saying, this is great, but remember that legally, you have to look after those with protected characteristics, and people and socioeconomic disadvantage, for reasons which are pretty obvious, and we can come back to in a second, is not a protected characteristic. a protected characteristic in law, it might be something you're sort of born with, such as a certain racial background. It might be something contingent like pregnancy, but it's something which wants to be cherished and protected. Now, I hope one does want to care for people from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds, but you don't want to protect poverty in itself. You don't want to cherish poverty. So it would be really ethically problematic to make socioeconomic disadvantage actually a legally protected characteristic. Now that gives rise to all sorts of issues. So, you know, because it can mean that age is a protected characteristic legally. So it can mean that somebody who's elderly and has a very comfortable life in a very wealthy environment is legally sort of, do they have to take precedence, you know, over somebody who's young but from a very disadvantaged background? So there's lots of interesting issues there to do with the protected characteristics. Payments. So there were quite a few times when I sort of raised not a red flag, but a little pink flag over the notion of payments, whether to providers or patients. I'm not saying they shouldn't happen. I'm just saying one has to look really carefully at the criteria to make sure the payment is encouraging the right kind of behavior, and it's not encouraging unnecessary operations and treatments, etc., and so on. And it's not giving people a chance to game a system, but maybe to their own actual disadvantage to their well-being, even if it's to their immediate financial advantage. So any talk of payments, again, I'm not saying they shouldn't happen, but you have to word the criteria under which they can be applied incredibly carefully, both for the providers and the patients. A lot of my ethics review is about waiting lists, because that's where the toughest and the most interesting ethical dilemmas arise in the prioritization of waiting lists. And that was one of the issues. I mean, there were four points of the care pathway where I thought that an ethics of flourishing and virtue might be helpful. One was in terms of decision coaches and decision providers. One was in terms of some cases of zero-sum redistribution, but particularly in terms of waiting list prioritization. So at the moment, as you know, you've got the different categories of clinical need, and nobody should interfere with a medical decision about which category of clinical need somebody is in. Within that category of clinical need, if you've got people who've been waiting in the same category of clinical need, and they've been waiting the same length of time, say for a knee operation, do you then look at non-clinical factors to see how much their well-being, their way of life is being impacted? Do they live with people who can drive them around, who can deliver shopping for them, who can put it away, who, you know, whether they're family or servants or whatever? Do they have a garden they can sit in? Do they have access to some kind of green space? So there's now those kind of questions, they don't directly ask how much money, you know, what's somebody's socioeconomic background. They're not directly looking at that, but because they're looking at overall well-being, very often socioeconomic background is indirectly going to affect those answers. So you might want to say that those non-clinical factors could be used to help prioritize when you've got two people in the same category of clinical need who've been waiting the same length of time. Now, an even more difficult question is, supposing you've got people waiting for a knee operation, same category of clinical need, but they've been waiting for slightly different lengths of time. But the person who's been waiting the slightly shorter length of time, their life is much, much more adversely affected, because I say they live at the top of a high-rise block of flats and the lift isn't working. Is it ever? We'll come back. There is no right or wrong answer to this. It's something for care boards to consider. Is it ever okay to have somebody jump the queue? And if so, for how long? I mean, are we just talking a few days, a few weeks? I mean, I would have thought a maximum of 2 or 3 months would be ethically acceptable. And I think somebody can only be queue jumped, as it were, once. It would not be fair for a wealthy person needing a knee operation to be put off indefinitely because there was always somebody more socially, economically disadvantaged waiting behind them. That would not be fair. Is it ever okay to adjust those times just by a few days or weeks? So that's something to for people to consider. Oh, hang on. Sorry, you've disappeared. There we go. Right. Okay. Come back now. Okay. So that, and though I said, there's no one size fits all right or wrong answer here. It's something for people to be aware of and to discuss. And these non-clinical factors were particularly discussed by that Ipsos poll, really interesting Ipsos poll that I studied. And that was very interesting. So on the whole, the people were open to the notion of overall well-being issues being considered in waiting list prioritization. They were much more nervous about socioeconomic background being one of the non-clinical factors that could be considered. However, you can't completely separate the two because socioeconomic background and overall well-being are so intricately intertwined. So that I did there were lots of really interesting issues there. We've discussed targets. On the whole, I mean, of course, you always need to honestly and carefully and scrupulously monitor outcomes. But I do suggest, at many points that concentrating on processes is ethically, I'm just talking about ethically justifiable decisions here, that is more helpful than concentrating on targets, which isn't to say that you ignore outcomes. Of course you don't. Of course you monitor them. And of course you readjust how you apply your process in light of the outcomes. But if you just focus on the targets, then I think you're always going to get this reduplication of the status quo. So I looked at that, and then there were a couple of so looking at processes rather than targets. And then there's a really interesting ethical issues to do with transparency, because of course transparency is a really big word in the NHS constitution, and transparency, accountability, and of course they're good things. There is a danger. So if people say in a socioeconomically disadvantaged group are not told that of the criteria for waiting list prioritization and find out sort of secretly that they are being preferred, and other people are also finding out that group is being preferred and they're not, and there's been no public discussion and no public consent for that, then people can get quite annoyed if those things come out. Is the answer to keep the criteria secret? No, I don't think so. I think the answer is, when you're dealing with these very sensitive discussions about non-clinical factors, that's when having a public debate is really helpful, and being not totally led by, but guided by and informed by what that group has said, because healthcare provision needs to be in an environment of trust and consent. And if it isn't, it's not going to get the outcomes it wants. If people kind of switch off from it and are not happy with the management style and the kind of criteria being used, and feel they've not been consulted and had no say in it, then people are going to switch off and not go for tests and so on and so forth. So transparency, which you might have thought an ethicist would say, yes, fantastic, of course I do, but it needs to be transparency within an environment of consent and consultation. Otherwise, transparency can actually lead to problems. So yeah, quite a lot.
That's brilliant. In the review, you were really strong on the public engagement work, particularly around waiting lists, and the work that we were doing with Ipsos at the time, which we were able to give you in draft, I thought was fascinating. One thing it touches upon is the sort of question of whose values matter in a particular equation. And one of the reasons I liked your focus on it in the review is, it seems to me that we, the citizenry, definitely have a view. Our values really matter in that equation. It's not a technocratic. It's not there's no technical answer to that question, is there? The values as to how you might prioritise people within particular clinical groups is not a technical question, is it?
It is. I mean, it isn't, because and that's one of the key messages I want to get over today. It's not like there is one amazing one-size-fits-all for all time ethical answer to waiting list prioritization, and you just need a professor of ethics to tell you what the answer is. It doesn't work like that at all, which is why I'm not a wealthy person. You know, if only the point is that when you're dealing with these very sensitive issues, when there are lots of ethical approaches. There are lots of routes that you could take which would be ethical in themselves, so long as they are implemented with care and thoughtfulness and integrity and humility. How do you choose? Well, for some of these things, you ask your local community, do you want these things to be factored in or not? Because we can factor them in, but only if you want us to. And I think it's really, really important. And also, if you consult, it's not just that consultation is a good thing in itself and will build trust, and which will help you get the take up that you want. But also, if you consult, you're going to get a wider, more diverse range of views. And that nearly always leads to better ethical decision making. Nearly always.
Well, could you elaborate on this a bit then? So one of the, in effect, it's the punchline of the review, it seems to me, is that you work your way through the report, you work your way through the different ethical strategies, the points raised, how they might be navigated, how you could square out some tensions. And then you land on a process that people could use to make an ethically justifiable decision. So could you just run us through that, please? That would be, I mean, you say there's no formula, there's no, you can't dispense this wisdom and charge us a fortune, but you can suggest a process for us. You
can suggest, and I suggest a 5-step process. But I also say it's only going to be helpful if it is undertaken, if certain points are acknowledged. So I'll give you the 5-step process, and then I'll run through a few of the most important background points that it need to inform the process. This is particularly if you're dealing with non-clinical factors, because I'm a great fan of experts. I'm not here to question medical expertise. But when you're dealing with non-clinical factors, you gather your best information available, you analyze the data. This is as your integrated care board team. You reflect and discuss on it. You then decide as a team whether you want to consult with the wider community. You won't always, there's not always time. There isn't always the money. You can't always be consulting on everything all the time, but sometimes you can. And if you do want to consult the wider community, what questions should be asked? And that kind of ethical discussion, I would love to see it normalized. I would love to just see that as, part of the weekly or monthly structure of things. Diverse views should be encouraged. You shouldn't be frightened of them. If you do decide to consult, you then consult with as wide and diverse range in the community as possible. And you do that with a mature acceptance that there's going to be tensions and trade-offs and ethical difficulties. You expect that. Of course there are going to be. That's the mature acceptance. You then analyse the results from your consultancy, you discuss again. You consider whether a focus on well-being of patients and practitioners might help in this instance. As I suggest in my review, focusing on an ethics of well-being and virtue can sometimes be really helpful in these non-clinical issues. And then, so long as you're not discriminating against protected characteristics, so long as you're abiding by the law, then you can go ahead, you take a decision. You have to take a decision, and we'll come into the conditions of that decision in a minute. Ethical philosophers like me, we can write an article and we can say, be open-ended at the end, and we can say, oh, this is really, really interesting, and here are the pros and cons. You can't do that. You've got to make a decision, and you've got to feel confident that if you go through this process, with care, with humility, with thoughtfulness, then you're going to be making an ethically justifiable decision, even if future data come in and you look back a year or two down the line and you think, oh, I wish we'd made a different ethical decision. That's life. You know, you can't help that. You're doing the best you can now in conditions of inevitable uncertainty. So these are one of the main things I wanted to say about how to implement this process is acknowledging that you're having to make a decision in inevitably uncertain conditions. Uncertain both because you can't know all the data and you certainly can't know future data, but also uncertain because it's not as if one ethical approach is always right. You know, as we've seen, they're all ethical approaches. So you make a decision knowing you're doing your best. So long as you're abiding by people's intrinsic human rights, treating them with respect, treating with dignity, you're doing your best. Also, so you acknowledge the uncertainty, you live with it, you make a decision, and you implement this process, as I said, with care, with thoughtfulness, with really considering, gathering the best data, considering it, being open to diverse views, not being upset if people critique your discussion, expecting that. That's how it works. And knowing that if you get diverse views, you're more likely to make a good decision. And if you go through that process, rather than focusing on the target, you are more likely, I would say, to have a better outcome. You'll certainly have an ethically justifiable outcome. And though the word virtue is not fashionable at the moment, and so you might prefer qualities of character, it is really matters here that the people making these decisions do take care, they do pay attention, they are open-minded, they do listen. You know, they have the humility to listen, and then you make a decision and you live with that. You have done your absolute best. You couldn't have done any more. You don't need a professor of ethics to tell you what decision to make. You've got all the tools you need to make these decisions yourself.
It's interesting. I've been monitoring the questions as they've been coming in. One really interesting question is about that thing about is about tools, is about applications, because that's what managers, that's what we want. We need tools and frameworks and things to do. I know the consequentialist view of the world in healthcare has got thousands of tools. It has analytical disciplines, you know, falling out of the cupboard. An ethics of virtue and of well-being has not got so many tools falling out of the cupboard, but it does have processes in the way that you were describing. And you've touched on it, but I want you to speak more fully about it. It asks us as decision makers, as the agent in the way you were describing it, to cultivate certain virtues or qualities, or what are those virtues? What are those qualities? And can I ask you practically what might one do? You know, how do you cultivate these virtues? How do you cultivate these qualities?
Well, we've talked about humility, honesty, integrity, sort of listening, care, attention, thoughtfulness. We've talked about all that. It really helps if you have a culture which gives you time to do that, which allows you time for these ethical discussions. As I said, I'm not, you know, I'm realistic. I know you can't be doing this every minute of every day, but maybe, you know, a few times a year that you have a sort of a kind of ethical sort of discussion group, and which rewards people. So in terms of, I don't know, your pay, in terms of selection criteria for jobs, you know, what are the criteria you're looking for when you're hiring people? What are the criteria for promotion? What are the criteria for merit pay? There are structural things you can do in terms of time allocation and in terms of, you know, job specification and promotion and merit pay and so on, which actually encourage the cultivation of these qualities, and certainly don't punish people for saying, actually, you know, the data, we made this decision, we did it in good faith, the data suggests it would have been better to make a different decision. that's one of my concerns about focusing too much on targets. Of course, I understand we want to treat lots of people in as short a time as possible for less money. I'm not daft, of course I understand that. But if that's your sole focus, then there could even unconsciously be huge pressure on managers to, maybe even from themselves. I'm not saying people are lying or being deliberately deceitful, but just not being open and honest about when things have not gone according to how you hoped they would go. You need an atmosphere where that kind of honesty is not punished and is indeed rewarded and encouraged. So there are things you can do. There are practical things you can do to do with job specification, to do with, appointments committees, promotion committees, and so on, which normalize, I keep using this word normalize, which normalize ethical debate and discussion, which allow it some time in admittedly hectic schedules. But you will save time. If you don't do it, you're going to lose a huge amount of time and money and legal battles later on. It is practical to do this.
I really like that. It also chimes a lot with general work we've been doing on decision making, where one of the key things is, given uncertainties about consequences and given uncertainties about the causal relationships between recommending to do something and things actually happening, that focusing in on the process and in on your own approach to the process is one place to go.
Yeah, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We're looking for how to make a good, just ethically justifiable decision, and if you keep looking for some unattainable perfection, you're not going to find it. And it's focus on the good.
And I actually think that literally was the punchline of the review, wasn't it?
I think so. I mean, I'm really trying, I really want to empower people to think, I don't need to have studied philosophy. I don't need to have a degree in this. I can do this myself in my life, and it will be better for me. It will be better for the patients. It will be better for the working environment. We will have fewer legal challenges, and in the long run, we'll save some money.
That's excellent. I take all of that on board, and yet you will have piqued some people's interest in virtue ethics and the ethics of well-being. I see in the chat box people are mentioning Martha Nussbaum's work and Mr. McIntyre's work.
Yeah.
Where would you point people? So if you have piqued the interest of a few people who've thought, oh, I've only been reasoning in terms of consequences to date, what is this thing called? But what resources would you point people at? Are there particular sources that you would say to follow from this conversation, go here?
Yes, I think it's Oxford University Press, their readings in virtue ethics. That's quite a good place to start. In the huge sort of compendiums that Peter Singer, he's a utilitarian, of course, but he's edited various volumes in which there are sections on virtue ethics. The book I used in my first year, it's also Oxford University Press, and it's a selection of readings from different ethical traditions edited by Peter Singer. I think you're in the discussion. I haven't had a chance to look at the chat. I imagine they've been looking at McIntyre's After Virtue. Martha Nussbaum and her pupil Nancy Sherman work hugely in this tradition, so that there's a huge amount out there. But I would start with something like readings in virtue ethics, and there's an article. It's quite old now, but I think it's from the 1990s, but it's still quite good, by, is it Gregory Trianowski, What is Virtue Ethics All About? I think that might be reprinted in the Oxford Readings in Virtue Ethics. So, or email me to get some more readings.
Well, so I was going to say, someone with your background saying a paper is quite old and then saying 1990s, I thought it would be on, parchment or something. You've been too modest. I would also point people at your videos and your resources. If people do want to find out more about you, you have a website.
Yes.
Twitter still exists, I think. It's 3 o'clock now.
We
don't know, do we? But just say a bit more about where people can find more of your work.
Yes, so angiehobbs.com, ANGIEHOBBS.com is my website that has thousands of links on it to stuff I've written, to radio and TV programs, to upcoming work. Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, which is mainly about philosophy. Occasionally I do get cross about politics and things on it, and there's cricket and stuff on there too. I still have a bit of my personal passions as well. So yes, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn as well. I'm on Facebook. If Twitter implodes, I'll go over to Mastodon, but Mastodon's, I'm hoping Twitter keeps going in some form, because on Mastodon you're on different platforms and you're mainly speaking to the converted in your own branch of the subject. So for all its terrible shortcomings, at least on Twitter, I have a chance of reaching out.
That's wonderful. Rachel, thank you ever so much, Angie. Just like on behalf of everyone in the session, on behalf of everyone at the Strategy Unit and the Decision Support Network, thank you ever so much for your work on the ethics review. The ethics review specifically, but introducing different ways of thinking about ethics more broadly. Really, really appreciate it.
And it's been a huge pleasure. Thank you so much. We've got about 3 minutes. Do we have time for a question or two or not?
I was just writing us out just to suggest that we don't. I've been trying to pick up the questions in my questions to you. Rachel, could you pop up the slide just to advertise what else we've got coming up in the Insight Festival? So, I mean, we're now entering week 2, but we have some events left that people will be interested in. We've got just let me pick out some highlights. The final session with David Dalton should be excellent on December the 1st, and on the 30th of November from Sarah J. Marsh. So we've got 2 people there talking from practice in really quite senior positions in the NHS in decision making. And then just to wave the flag, on the 30th, I'll be introducing an event with colleagues from Ipsos, looking at their toolkit for making more evidence-based decisions when approaching decision making. But that's it. It just remains for me to say thank you again to Angie for her work, and to please register for any further Insight sessions if anything that I've just run through very quickly piques your interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Have a good week. Have a good week with lots of insight. Okay, bye now. Bye now. Thank you. Bye-bye.